Okay, so for our policy roundtable, again, the goal is to try to cast our eyes towards the future and to talk about the future. Can be next week, but it's to talk about how the evidence and all the other factors that we've been talking about can be viewed as contributing to the best way to bring these new treatments into practice in a way that will obviously optimize the chance for patients, appropriate patients, to benefit from them. We'll talk about the value piece, about potential budget impact piece, and one of the reasons that we do our reports so that they arrive at or near the time of FDA approval is because this is the time when insurers are putting together their first coverage policies. Many of these coverage policies will not change for quite a long time. This is also the time when the prices are being negotiated. And so even though we know that we'll learn more about these drugs as time goes forward, a lot happens in the next month or two. Some has already happened, as we'll hear about. But this is a chance for us to kind of explore and hopefully to bring into the public, again, a little bit more of the thinking behind what goes into some of the decisions that are made on pricing, coverage, and other things. So we're very happy to welcome. I'm going to kind of block part of the roundtable for some of this time, but I want to introduce some of the new members we have. We have the same patient representatives and clinical experts. We have with us now 4 other people. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but you can see the names up there. But first, Richard, why don't you introduce yourself and just where you're from? Hope this is around.
Hello. I'm Richard Sun, medical consultant with CalPERS. The California Public Employees Retirement System purchases and administers health benefits for approximately 1.4 million members here in California.
All right. So you represent the big purchaser.
Yes.
All right. Amy.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Amy Benavente. So I lead our market access functions for neuroscience at Amgen, of course, for Arenumab, otherwise known as Aimovig.
All right. Aaron.
Yep. Good afternoon, Aaron Divas. I'm the Global Disease Area Lead at Teva for migraine and headache.
And Everett.
Hi, good afternoon. Everett Neville, Express Scripts. And we represent or make recommendations or coverage for about 80 million Americans as a PBM.
All right. So we've got Express Scripts, CalPERS, drug makers, along with clinical experts and patients. It feels like we could do anything, right? It's a great group. So I'm going to ask the CTAF panel, if you have any particular comments or questions, feel free to put your tent up. I'll try to wheel around every once in a while and see you. I am going to start with the patients again. So we've had that discussion. It's not so much I want you to reflect back and how you feel about the votes or anything, but looking forward, does it feel like we've done an adequate job of trying to capture the diversity of the experience with migraine and how the evidence, in a sense, can be looked at by policymakers now that we're starting to shift in that direction? Jill?
There were parts of the ICE report that I thought were very sensitive to the complexity of the disease of migraine, and I appreciate that it's not just a headache, it's a constellation of other kinds of symptoms and problems, in addition to the comorbidities. I think you recognize those as well. My issue is now with the concern about episodic patients being treated on a different plane than the chronic patients.
Yeah. I wonder if we'd be here if Botox hadn't come along first and had a label for chronic but not for episodic. Yeah. It's almost like that set the stage for a lot of thinking around that numbers as being important. But we'll talk, when we talk about coverage policy, we'll get into the weeds a bit on different ways to think about number of migraine days per month or whatever it's going to be that's going to be part of the coverage policy for these.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add
Sure.
I agree that some of the sensitivity of understanding this complex disease and the heterogeneity of how people experience it. But unlike Botox, this is a situation where this drug has been approved for both episodic and chronic. It's been deemed safe and efficacious. And As someone who is the caregiver to someone who has actually gotten on this medicine, I share in concerns about the long-term data. But I got to say that, when you're dealing with pain every single day and taking a crazy amount of other medicines that, have known side effects, known dangers, the risk of something that is unknown, and at least in short term has been documented as incredibly safe, it pales in comparison. And I think that wasn't fully understood by or reflected in the votes by this panel. And so I again want to point that out, and I think that as we talk about some of these next steps and what that means, I encourage people to think about that desire for access and empowering patients to make their own informed choices for access to an FDA-approved medicine that is approved for someone with that condition.
All right. So I went back to make sure I had the language right. We've talked about the evidence, and groups like this usually focus on the limitations, right? We talk about where we don't have this, we do, don't. The FDA label is this is marketed, or this is labeled for the preventive treatment of migraine in adults. That's pretty big. So I'm going to ask the clinical experts now, how is this going to be used by clinicians? How do you think a clinician in this world would view who should get these, who shouldn't, who should try something else from a clinical, purely clinical perspective? And if you want to, I'll get there eventually if you don't, but throw in Botox. So given the way that insurance structures work, we know that most patients to get Botox have to try A, B, C, or D, and then if that doesn't work, they can get access to Botox. How, from a clinical perspective, do you see a patient who's failed A, B, C, or D, and you have Botox and you have CGRPs, what's the process going to look like? So that's one piece of my question. I've asked a very big one. But basically, we're in a new era. These CGRPs are coming. One's available. The label is broad. What are clinicians going to do?
So
Sonia.
I could start sort of from the broad area. I read this in the surgeon's blog, and I thought it encapsulated sort of making a choice for treatment. When I'm looking at treatment, I look at how effective something is. And if the efficacy is about the same, then I look at the safety. And if the safety is about the same, then I look at the cost. And so I was excited to have a new group of medications for migraine because we really are very limited. But the efficacy to me does not seem to be much more different than is what before. And so now I go and look at safety. And the initial safety data looks really good, but the history of medicine is littered with initial looking good at safety. Thalidomide is one example, and then you don't know. It's been tested in thousands of patients, not what really you need for rare side effects. And and then it goes to cost. And so I'm going to say it's going to be about equal to Botox, if we're going to talk about the chronic patients. One of the things, in my mind is for the safety data, I look at what the FDA said. They want post-marketing surveillance for heart attacks, for strokes, for liver inflammation, and for pregnancy. So when I'm looking at using it, if the FDA is concerned, I'm going to be concerned at that point as well. I look at the clinical trial entry criteria for the trials. If they didn't want certain patients in the clinical trials, I don't want them to be among the first patients I'm going to use it, because I'm going to use this medication, but I want it to be safe until we have those lots of patients that the rare side effects can emerge. So now I can make the specific indication, specific comparison to Botox.
Actually, I merged two questions. Why don't you hold on to that and let me
That's
that
not my
comment
first
too. So big picture, new drug. We've heard at least from one neurologist that the patients are very active in starting to seek this. What do you think is going to be the way that it brings in, that it should be brought into the clinical practice?
I agree with every single word that Dr. Petrovic said.
And that's not just because I used to be her program director.
But yeah, I advocate for my patients to get the meds that they really need. So that being said, efficacy is one thing, and right now there isn't a head-to-head. There's no one that says this is better than another. The other thing is that safety is really important. So it depends on who the patient is. Are they a young female? Are they family planning, right, et cetera? Comparing to Botox, Botox has a bit more of like a longer history, and there's more kind of a sense that, oh, the headaches get better with the second set of injections and then third injections. And so you can kind of get an idea and set the patient up for expectations. I don't know if that, I get that sense yet from these medications, and also the long-term safety. It's exactly what she said. So I do, I'm not opposed to using it, but in the right patient with an extensive discussion about safety and what the long-term plan is.
Yeah. My dad was a practicing doctor, and he used to say that in his day, it was a long time ago, you never wanted to be the first doctor on the block to use something new, and you never wanted to be the last one. You wanted to be somewhere in the middle. So I don't know if a lot of doctors are going to have some caution around CGRPs or not, just in that kind of general sense. But let's focus in specifically on chronic migraine, because that's the one where I'm wondering, because we talked about how the evidence itself excluded patients who were, in a sense, at the far end of having tried and failed a lot of other prior treatments. But that's almost from a clinical unmet need where you would want to try CGRPs first, or it's the only thing you really can do. So it's kind of like, I can imagine a clinician really struggling because the evidence is weakest where I really want to use it most.
And that is really it's exactly the case. So, certainly anyone who treats headache has a lot of patients in whom nothing else has worked. And then if it's going to be safe in those patients, then there is not a reason not to use it, because it's really in that category of nothing else has worked. So you're going to go do it. And you can describe, this is what the FDA says, and this is what we know. And yes, we will use it in that population. But that's actually the less difficult question. It's the more difficult question as you use the patients who are new to prevention. Mm-hmm. When are you going to start to use it? I think, from the category of, let's say I have a patient and they could get Botox, but they can also get the CGRP antibody. And then when you go to them, then you can talk about in terms of, well, this is what we know about Botox, and this is what we know about CGRP. And there are patients who absolutely don't want to have Botox. Some have facial surgery with reconstruction. You can't see the scars. They're really worried about their face is not going to look well. Yeah. There are people who don't like needles. And so there's some people, again, in the healthy population, that's not a concern. That's a discussion to have. You talk about the knowns and the unknowns. And, sort of patient preference-wise. Okay.
Yvette, anything you'd add to that?
Well, the only other thing is that right now, and the folks, the patients who are here are the folks who have had the most difficult patients. And that's the folks that we have who've been on 6 oral medications and Botox and infusions and, and that's not who was studied in these trials. It does make the decision-making a bit more challenging.
Yeah. Is there any, I'll jump all the way to research now, because are there any mechanisms around to have a registry? And maybe you mentioned a registry, but is there any way to start to capture this new group of patients who were not included in the clinical trials because of the number of prior treatment failures? Is there a way for the clinical community to rapidly learn about their experience with these patients? It won't be randomized, but what's out there to do
I would actually love to do something like that, and it's just finding someone who has the bandwidth to just actually, it's not randomized, but you start to look at patients, like we know in epilepsy. First, for patients with epilepsy, I think it's like 55% will respond to the first medication. You try the second one, you maybe get to 70, and by the third one, 85% have responded. It doesn't matter what you try. And then you're left with 15% who don't seem to respond to anything. So we don't know if it's like that. We don't know if there are any genetic determinants of what will tell what one person will respond to, one person won't. I think that will be coming down the line. We will, certainly I imagine this is going to be used by these medications are going to be used by many people. So we will, in a short, fairly short period of time, have better understanding of safety mechanisms. And as in the real world, as we see, and one of the things I think anyone who sees a lot of headache will start to, in their mind, get a sense of how something works or not. And so you'll get that sense. I was very heartened to hear that someone who had tried everything did great with CGRP, because that's what I wanted to hear. Right, I wanted to know that there was someone who did great, because when I'm talking to my patients, they ask me. I can now say, yes, there's someone who was like you who really responded, and that gives them that hope. But because we don't have that safe, it's really that, because CGRP is everywhere in your body. It's involved in wound healing, it's involved in placenta formation, there's all sorts of, in all the blood vessels, in your arteries, and all pain in your body. So you don't know what long-term blockade is going to do.
So let me ask the patients. Believe me, we're going to get to the pricing and coverage. I know it's hanging in the air. But, and actually this kind of links in a bit to one of the public comments made by one of the other manufacturers where, and we'll talk about how many patients are going to be eligible and what we think about the budget impact. But from the patient advocacy or the patient community perspective, how should the promise of these drugs be marketed to patients? Is there a way that it could be oversold as a potential cure? Is there a way it could be? Because I know you're dealing with, you want a lot of the patients who haven't even been diagnosed to get adequate diagnosis and treatment. This obviously offers a new option for many patients. But what kinds of patient information should be out there, both from the manufacturers and from clinicians, to help patients understand where we are with CGRPs today?
What patients need to understand is that currently there's no cure for migraine. It's a neurobiological, genetically associated disease. And for a drug company to flout that it's a cure is misleading at best. And
well, I didn't imply that they were going to say
unethical at
that.
worst.
Don't worry, don't worry.
So
I didn't imply it. But
I would say for marketing purposes that they should stick to the data about the efficacy of the drug.
okay.
That's what I
Remind
would
me, was it 26% of patients with chronic went to 0 migraine days? 26?
The super responders?
Super responders.
Yeah.
I don't like that term, but
Oh, I love it. You want to wear a T-shirt.
everybody wants to be a super responder. Yeah. It makes people feel guilty if they're not. But after a year, so there's a tension here because you could say, it's, according to the data, 1 out of 4 patients have their migraines go away. Can you imagine for the people who wrestle with it for years to be told that 1 out of 4, you get a 25% chance at having those migraines gone? The attorney, I'm sorry for your name, if she's still here.
Lynn.
Lynn, thank you. So how are you going to talk to doctors and patients? How can you envision what you're going to do with the marketing for this?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to.
Please.
This is my first time, so I'm not sure the protocol, but I
Oh,
thought
I
that
didn't
was,
see.
I thought
Oh,
that
I'm
was
sorry.
hand raising.
Well, I'm Phil Donahue, so I can ignore you. I can ask you unfair questions. I can do all those things. But at the end of the day, it's my show. No,
We will not be ignored as manufacturers.
we don't throw chairs. We don't do that kind of stuff.
Excellent. Violence should never be the
No,
solution.
no.
So a couple comments. And so I know it's always hard in these things because, like our esteemed Lilly colleague talked about earlier, data is still coming out. So one thing is Liberty study actually was reviewed at AAN that does look at patients that have failed 2 to 4 lines of therapy. So they're either in their 3rd or 5th line of therapy. So just to note that it is not all in the earlier patients.
Right.
And the only other thing that I would say about this is, of course, any new drug, any new class of drug, you're going to worry about the safety profile. But the FDA is also charged with a very challenging task of weighing safety versus efficacy. And if you read all the drugs, at least I've worked on, it has a fairly, it has a very clean safety profile at this point. So I'm not discounting anything that the clinicians have said. I just wanted to make that point. But you asked me a different question, and the question is around how are we going to market it. Mm-hmm. And this has been something I've been to Express Scripts multiple times. We've had these discussions, and also you can see it in our marketing materials. One thing that I think we are all on the same page on, which is great when we can say the way ICER looked at it, the way payers want it, and the way, at least from an Amgen, Novartis perspective, we're looking at it is we do see this for treatment-experienced patients. We did study a broader population, so I know there was also this kind of comment around, well, what if you keep going broader? Right. We actually studied an incredibly broad population, 4 or more naive to therapy were included within our studies, but we, understanding the economics of this country, understanding that there are other preventive therapies out there. We're not asking for naive patients. We've never had one conversation asking for it. And when you actually look, proof is in how our sales team goes out and talks to physicians about it. When you look at the patient profiles that we're depicting, we depict patients that have previously been on therapy. So even that's consistent amongst the way our medical team talks about it, our marketing team talks about it, and our access team talks about it.
All right, thanks. All right, we're getting close to the talking. Bill, do you have a comment?
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really important when one is designing a market plan and policies moving forward to bring new interventions to patients is it's not only looking at the effectiveness and the long-term use and safety and affordability, but it's also health equity. And I think one of the mistakes we've seen with other diseases is when you take a medication and you determine that you're going to use that medication for either only the severe patients or only those in very early onset of a condition. And I think when you look at this, we should be looking at health equity in a manner where it's addressing a patient that has the condition regardless of the condition severity of that condition. Because when you separate out, you create a discriminatory action with regard to care. And I've seen this in other conditions.
All right, so let me bring that back then into the way we'll build insurance coverage, because it may raise some of these questions.
Yeah.
But I do acknowledge that Amgen has been very clear in all the material that's been put out before that they are thinking of this as the approach, with pending other data that patients would be treatment experienced, I guess is one way to put it. So I'm going to get to you in a second about the employer's perspective on this, and I have some interesting questions. But I do want to start to build a proto model for how to think through an insurance coverage policy. Now, this is not to say that this is the one right way to cover these drugs. It's to try to tease out what the considerations are going to be and to get some input on how people think it, different ways to think through that part of an insurance coverage policy. So we're going to walk through which patients, we're going to walk through which doctors, and we're going to walk through other aspects of the step therapy approach. What has to happen, that's kind of linked to which patients. So let me start, and this is going to be a lot of talking to clinical experts, but also to you guys who are either already have done your first insurance coverage prior auth or are certainly considering it. First of all, headaches, migraine headaches. It's really hard to tell them apart sometimes, what's a migraine versus a non-migraine. For many clinicians, they may get it wrong or they may think it's hard to tell. Is there any role in the design of an insurance coverage policy to try to define what a migraine headache is? Who gets to decide? Is it just the clinician's decision? This is a migraine headache.
So,
am I clear? It's just sometimes people wonder how will we know that patients with other kinds of headaches, and maybe we don't know that it won't work for them too, but is there a reason to consider a definition of migraine headache? We'll get to the number of migraines, but what do you think?
Well, I've thought of this before. The reason to try and have clinicians make a specific headache diagnosis is for patients you can't get the right treatment unless you have the right diagnosis. And, being able to tell what kind of headache a patient has is the only way that the correct treatments will be considered.
So let me flip this over, because I think I've put you in a spot where it'll be easier actually to ask Everett, perhaps.
Yes.
So Everett, is it just going to say migraine headache? Is it going to say as determined some specific way?
Yeah, this is actually a very easy, I think, disease state to reach agreement on what we should do. A very difficult disease state to actually administer that, because there's no clear test, right? It's really easy to do cholesterol levels.
Right.
You can do a test for that. payers don't want to be in the middle of the medical decision. They just want to ensure that they're not paying a lot more money for something than they ought to, or that something's not being used when a really cheap alternative exists. So if you look at the criteria as we've already developed and we already have in place for about half of our lives, so about 40 million lives, the other 40 million we've made the recommendation. And it really was somewhat price dependent. And we've had conversations with Amgen and with Teva and quite frankly with Lilly. And I would commend Amgen for coming in at what we would consider a responsible price, much lower than what we were concerned. Because the lower the price, the less we have to worry about overuse or misuse, right? If it were $10 a month, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't care. We'd let the doctors do whatever they wanted to do. That said, our criteria are fairly loose. It's 4 headaches a month, and a patient that has tried 2 chronic medications in the past. We don't define what a migraine is. We assume you've been diagnosed with a migraine. That's a physician decision. The challenge for us with a step therapy or a prior authorization is that in this population, those chronic medications, those prophylactic medications, may have been used 5 years ago, 15 years ago. The databases don't look back that far. So it's really easy if you're on a drug and you were on it in the last year for us to look back, see that you had that prescription, and automatically cover it. In this case, we're going to have to run them through a prior authorization. Now, the challenge with that is you can do it prior authorization really difficultly or really easy from a physician point of view. We could ask for proof, for chart notes, and effectively what that would mean is a lot of patients that have tried 5, 6, 4 medications would have to try 2 more again because you wouldn't have any proof. We did not want to go there, and that's why we really negotiated hard for a price. So we've actually gone with the physician attestation. If the physician says the patient tried 2 medications, we're going to believe you. Now, if we start seeing a lot of misuse, we'll have to revisit that. We do believe, because this is an injected medication, that there will be less patients who just try it for the novelty. We're not going to have a lot of patients come in that say, I had a migraine last month, maybe I should try this. We will monitor that, but as it stands today, it's 4 headaches a month on average. We're not asking for a diary. Again, that's physician attestation. There have been discussions if the drug were really expensive that you'd require a headache diary. We're not requiring that. And then a previous history at some point of 2 chronic medications.
All right. And I hope that that word may be foreign to some people in the audience, at least the attestation. There is a huge difference in the way that insurance kind of provisions are applied, whether they require documentation from the medical record or the physician can tick a box to say, yes, this patient has tried 2 medications. So there's going to be no definition of what a failure of those previous medications are. No
Our
looking
current
to
criteria
see.
does not define failure. Again, we can revisit this. Our thought is that today, the vast majority of patients that you'll treat will have met this criteria. And as you heard from patients today, the bulk of the patients that will get this in the first couple of years did not have their first migraine last week. They've had migraines for years. They've really tried these therapies, and they either didn't work or the side effects were too bad.
Right.
And so they're still seeking help. I think we have to be careful when we get 3, 5 years from now, and doctors are very comfortable with these medications. My friends to the left are running ads reminding people if you have a headache, maybe it's a migraine. And we have people coming in asking for medications by name who may have tried nothing. And that's where I think the danger is for us. Our goal is to get the price cheap enough that we won't care. You're listening? Okay. But that is, I think, it's not a concern today. We think the pent-up demand for this is largely patients like we heard today. Right. None of the patients we heard today are even close to the criteria, right? They're so far beyond. It will be at some point in the future when you have someone who saw a TV ad and a beautiful life in a field of grain because they have a migraine drug that start coming in. You laugh, but people come in for a lot of strange, ask doctors, and they ask for things by name, and they may not even have the condition. And that's where we are worried, but that's a year or 2 from now.
All right. And just real quickly, a follow-up, and then I'll come down. 4 headaches a days per month. Does that come from the clinical guidelines? Is that where that number
we
came
have
from?
so we employ a clinical group, what we call our P&T committee, that do not, we hire them. I don't know who they are. They won't let me know who they are. The people that make the decisions in the company don't manage them. They're self-regulating group of physicians and pharmacists. They, along with our clinicians, we have a small clinical group that interfaces with them.
Right.
I am a pharmacist, but I'm not a clinician, so I don't make clinical decisions. So that came out of our clinical physician group, and they decided and I think it gets down to severity, right? We didn't want to have a severity guide. You know, our bet is at the price that we have, that there will not be enough misuse to justify an intensive process that is difficult for patients and expensive to run from a payer perspective. We'll monitor that, but that's our initial take on this.
All right, thanks. And we'll come back to the price too. So just to focus in for other people's thinking, and I believe that the 4 days per month for headaches or 4 days per month does come out of AAN guidelines, or at least some consensus statements about who should be eligible for preventive therapy.
Could be considered.
Could be
That's when you start to
considered.
consider.
You should start to consider at 4 days or 4 headaches per month? All right. So I think your group probably leveraged that earlier work. And I'm not,
That's why they don't let me make clinical
you don't
decisions.
know.
I don't
Right.
read the guidelines.
Got it. Kevin, you had something you
I
wanted
just
to
want to add in, I'm heartened to hear a lot of what you're talking about here, and I think that it makes sense from the patient community. We're never advocating for this to be a first-line treatment or for those who have a minuscule amount of migraine attacks, that less than 4 days. That's just not a strong severity of disease. And then I also want to say that your point about the physician attestation is really vital. We have a fractured healthcare system. We have an EMR system that is non-operable, and it shouldn't be the patient's fault that maybe their insurance changes, which forces them to change physicians, and their records don't follow them. So having that respect for the relationship between patients and their doctors, and when they say, hey, trusting that relationship, if they're testified, I've tried that, it didn't work for me, and I'm the level of severity, this isn't my first line treatment, all of that is great, and we support it. And I hope that is a model that the rest of the industry follows.
And I would give, Steve Miller's not here, our chief medical officer, but as Amgen can attest, we really fought hard on a price because Steve, knowing how our systems don't work that well in this country, to try to figure out if someone had a they're on, let's say they're on amitriptyline today and they still think it's not working, to find out that they had propranolol in 1999 is not going to happen in our system today.
Yeah.
And so we didn't want to have to try to administer that and put patients through that.
Doesn't your policy, I think this is in the public domain, no, I know it is, that's why I'm going to say it, requires a triptan?
We do require there's a history of, if you have a history of
triptans
that you've
now?
tried again, attestation, we find it unlikely anyone with chronic headaches won't have tried a triptan.
Right.
As
I have this weird, and this is again my own personal bias, having seen this from personal as well as kind of clinical practice. Patients can get so frustrated with their attempt to get the triptans they need each month. I can imagine they're being really hungry for CGRPs just so they can overcome the triptan kind of access issues. Whereas if it were easier for them to get triptans.
I think it's pretty easy to get a triptan. Some plans limit how many you can get.
It's the number.
We don't require that you've used 400 triptans, just one.
No, but I've witnessed the rationing of triptans through the month that somebody else talked about, and it's very common. And I don't know what role that will play in patients' interest in CGRPs, but maybe neurologists and others would have a view. Jeff?
Well, I mean, yes, rationing triptans for cost is ridiculous, but, there's always a but, you can overuse triptans just like everything else, and you can run into problems.
Yeah.
And so and this is one of the problems and why it is important to have effective preventatives. It is really easy to get into medication overuse. It's almost impossible to avoid it if you have frequent headaches, unless you're really on top of it. So I think some of the triptan limitation is actually trying to avoid making the whole problem worse. Now, it probably shouldn't be coming from the insurance company, but there
certainly were some restrictions because of cost, but the cost of a triptan is so low today. Any restrictions still in place are really clinical concerns. You're well under $30 a day cost to a plan.
And just to clarify on that, for the triptans, not everyone.
I'm sorry, $30 a month.
There's some who are excluded from being able to use it because of cardiovascular issues. Is there an exception that they don't have?
There's always
policies, right? And it's not
exceptions,
safe?
and so obviously the criteria actually gets quite long. If you satisfy the initial criteria, you're fine. If you have allergies, if you have reasons you can't take these, you can't be on a beta blocker because you have asthma, all of those things, you can get through the exception, but the majority of patients you can get through with 4 questions.
So
Steve.
which providers are going to be, one more question, I'll come back.
Can we hear what CalPERS and Kaiser, their coverage?
Well, Kaiser, they're not here representing the health plan. The health plan doesn't make those decisions, the doctors' groups do.
Right, so I can
But you
say
can cover that.
there was an interregional work group of pharmacists and physicians from the entire country who came up with practice recommendations. It's not even practice guidelines, but practice recommendations. And in Kaiser, it's not like you do need prior authorization. Doctors can be free to do what they want, but this is what we recommend. It can be used in both episodic and chronic migraine. We do, for the episodic, we sort of say, think about 8 headache days a month, or if, let's say you have 2 headaches, they last 2 or 3 days, and you don't have a treatment for them. So it's trying to sort of get the sense of whether, to get to a severe, some sense of severity. The recommendation is that patients will have tried 3 preventatives, 2 of them have some evidence, so some quality evidence that they're effective for 2 months there's no dose, but sort of, what the maximum dose that they tolerated. And there's no sense that you have to look it up and, find evidence. People can take people at their word for that. So I think I've captured that.
One other question I was going to ask Everett, but I'll ask you first. So can primary care docs prescribe this or just neurologists?
So neurologists and pain management, because in some areas pain management treats headache, but not primary care doctors.
So my understanding of the way that a lot of integrated groups work, the vast minority of migraine patients will ever see a neurologist.
I wish.
So if, I think it's still the minority, but I'm wondering if the interest in CGRPs will lead to real access crunch in neurology, and is that just an indirect way of managing utilization? Let me let you think about that, and then I'm going to ask Everett how they're doing it.
And I think not, because our expectation is that primary care will use the preventatives that primary care knows how to use. So primary care knows how to use beta blockers. They know how to use venlafaxine. They know how to use the tricyclics.
Right.
They know how to use vitamin B2. So they know how to initiate. And so we try to teach our primary care doctors. We might try to make it easy for them through all sorts of things in the medical record for them to treat migraine early, because the earlier, so earlier you treat something, maybe, you think hopefully the better the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't think that there will be an access crunch, because we also tell our primary care doctors, hey, there's this new medication, but, there are some prerequisites.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if others are going to feel like neurology is going to be a pinch
That's the
point. 'Cause
fear, I
it's
think.
hard to get appointments in neurology in many systems, so it could be that, again, the patients who are here today speaking and, the really kind of worst end of the spectrum of suffering, they will be in the care of neurologists. But I'm just wondering if there might
I've had
be some...
fewer questions about this than I thought I would.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah.
We did not restrict it to
So
neurologists.
primary care could prescribe it?
Any physician can prescribe it. Certainly, if we have problems, we'd relook at that. But as of today, we don't have a restriction on any specialty.
Interesting.
Yeah, look, and I think there's enough barriers in place for these patients already that, why just arbitrarily introduce additional barriers? Primary care physicians, they already have the ability to prescribe and diagnose antidepressants and other things along the line. Right now, they can prescribe other preventive medications for migraine. So why would you now take an approach and say, now we're going to limit a primary care physician from being able to use this product when it's demonstrated to be extremely safe and tolerable? A lot of times these monoclonal antibodies get restricted in certain cases because of the high cost, but also because of the other safety events that could come along with it. And I just don't think at this point in this category, when patients are struggling to get into physicians already, there's a shortage of headache specialists, there's a shortage of neurologists that focus on migraine. Why would we put that in place to be a barrier for these individuals that need to see someone?
Well,
I would say,
go ahead.
because it's a first-in-class medication that's never been used for anything else before. and you have it tested on thousands of patients, and that's not enough for rare side effects to occur. All of these recommendations that we have will be revisited as time goes on, but we don't want to sort of expose people as guinea pigs. What I've heard from many doctors, frankly, is they wouldn't use it until it's been around for a couple of years. And so it is, on one hand, as I say, it's efficacy, safety, and cost. Some of our headache specialists are primary care doctors. It's because that's what they do, the people who do it. And the main caution, yes, cost is a consideration, but everything else we've tried for headache has had a track record in other treatments. And this may end up being the safest medication. It's too soon. And that is the caution in really, the big caution is its use.
I think you also have to look at the different health systems, and I think that makes complete sense for Kaiser.
Right.
We have clients in the middle of Nebraska. The nearest neurologist that treats migraines might be 3 hours away. So from a national perspective, it could be quite a burden in Montana to require a neurologist. Not as much burden in Los Angeles or in New York.
Yeah.
And so we have to have something that fits everywhere.
That's interesting.
We will have plans that probably individual plans
you will.
that require neurologists.
Yeah, I can guarantee that there will be plans that go with neurology only, just because that is the usual pattern for a brand new class of drugs, an injectable in particular, whether it's psoriasis or, even when it's a pill, hepatitis C, it was, basically only in the hands of gastroenterologists for a while. Richard, I wanted to ask you, and weave in, if you would, a question I was going to ask you about how does the purchaser, and by here I would say employer, how do they think about the value of these drugs and their potential for productivity impact? And how would that influence the way you would want your PBMs and health plans and doctors, et cetera, to think about it?
Well, thanks, Phil. And I'd like to first, though, answer the question over here about CalPERS policy on these drugs.
Yeah.
We do not have a policy. It is actually fairly rare when we as a purchaser make a policy that affects all of our 7 health plans and 1 PBM. So for these drugs, we would defer to OptumRx, our PBM, or Kaiser or Blue Shield that have their own pharmacy programs. Each of these organizations has pharmacy and therapeutics committees or other professional groups that conscientiously go over the literature and evidence, just like this group does. There's no way that we could second guess them at CalPERS. Having said that, though, if there are going to be complaints about what the PBM or health plan has done, we have a systematic process to deal with appeals. So, for example, several years ago, this was about 2010, there was an appeal about Botox being used for migraines. The health plan had denied it. When it came to my desk, though, I said, well, look, there are these studies that are newly published, and we should probably approve this, and we did. Now, to get back to productivity, CalPERS may be different from other organizations that do purchasing. We only do purchasing. We are not the employer. CalPERS has only about 2,000 employees itself. However, we purchase on behalf of about 1,000 different employers, public agencies throughout the state of California. Nevertheless, productivity is important. I don't think that we have a big hand in determining policy because of what I just said about policy, based on productivity considerations. And yet, if these drugs improve productivity, that's great.
Because I've heard, at least from a couple of employers, that, for instance, when we have our different results, and there's the health system perspective and the societal perspective, which usually is another way of saying trying to weave in productivity. It should maybe have other things too, but that this is one area where they are particularly sensitive to whether there is a big impact, because a lot of employers do recognize what Mr. Briggs, I think his name was, mentioned as the significant impact on productivity that headache, in particular migraine headache, has. So I was not surprised by that, but it's an interesting feature. Okay, another question about coverage. Step therapy within CGRPs. There are going to be very soon 2, then 3 available. Would you assume that you could negotiate further price discounts and just have 1 on your formulary? Do you need more than 1? If so, would you allow them even, or what happens if a patient tries one CGRP and doesn't feel like they're not one of those 26% that had complete resolution? Maybe they try the other one and they could be one of the lucky ones. How are you going to manage people who want to take multiple CGRPs? And how do you think your formulary will structure access to those?
We haven't made that decision yet, and I think the data, as you guys discussed, we don't have enough data to know. There are two, different mechanisms, if you will, within these three initial products. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that makes a difference, we don't know. I think initially we will probably need to have at least one of the three. Mm-hmm. We would probably prefer to have two, so that we had each type. But again, the P&T will direct that as the data and the evidence comes out.
All right. But could you imagine, I could imagine, again, some health plans saying, if you flunk one, they still usually would, in many other areas, if you flunked a TNF inhibitor, it doesn't mean you can't get another one.
Typically, even if you had only one product on formulary, you'd be able to try the second one if you failed the first one.
If you failed it. But I would also anticipate, given that the mechanisms of action, even though they're not perhaps identical, they're really close, that many PBMs and health plans might say, well, this is the way the market should work. We should be able to negotiate and say, we'll give all of our business to whichever one of you will give us the best price. Could you envision that happening?
I think that's likely. The question is whether we feel we need two or one.
Two or one.
It's unlikely.
To do that
it's unlikely that you'll see three.
Right. Okay, good.
Yeah, look, from our point of view, from a, manufacturer point of view on that, I'll go back again to, looking at the patients and the physicians that are going to treat these individuals. We think they should have access and have the choice. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's better for everyone when they have more of a choice. And I think each of these products, though they do have a lot of similarities, they do have some unique benefits that can separate them. And so I think that physicians are going to want to be able to have a choice as to which product it is they want to prescribe, and patients are going to want to be able to have that choice as well. So in my mind, our approach is that we should have as much open access as possible with this category and give individuals the choice.
And at the right price, we can make that happen. So I'm thinking $50.
I was going to say, I was going to do the Phil Donahue though here and pose you a tough question, which was, so you would reject an offer to have the entire market share of a major payer unless they kept open access to all two or three drugs?
I'm sure we'll have those negotiations.
But I will say, and we do believe in choice where that can be managed. So I 100% echo Aaron's sentiment, and that was something that came into consideration when we thought about how to price the product. There were a lot of things that came into consideration, but really, taking a very patient-centric pricing model, we understand there are differences. There are differences between all three.
Right.
And the mechanism is the first one, and there's no science to tell us one is better than the other. And so that is going to take time, and physicians are going to want access.
Okay, so you open the door and I'll walk right through it. Pricing, right? Pricing. So congratulations. You guys anticipated the findings of the ICER report and pegged your price right to the sweet spot. We know that's exactly what happened. We were thrilled, as I'm sure the patient community was, to hear that a company and payers were actually thinking about the threshold at which coinsurance would not apply, but a copayment would. For those of you, again, who don't know that, this was, again, Tony Hooper or somebody said explicitly that was a major part of the thinking, was that this would be a lower financial burden on individual patients if it came in under the specialty pharmaceutical price threshold. It feels like we're in a different world than we were with PCSK9s 2 years ago. Injectable drugs, preventive, serious potential outcomes, list price $14,000. Here we are in the $6,000s. What changed? What has changed? Where are we? What does this mean? It feels good. It feels good that we're getting price aligned with the benefit to patients. It feels good that that's being reflected in lower out-of-pocket costs for patients. It feels good that is being linked to attestation-based prior auth. How did we get to a better place?
quick interject, it will feel good if patients can get access. And that
the
is
proof
not,
is in the pudding.
yeah,
The proof is in the
exactly.
pudding.
And so there are other stakeholders who need to follow through and make sure that access happens. So let's not declare victory just yet.
All right, so a tiny, yes, I agree.
Good answer.
And I first want to say I love that comment. Thank you very,
Yeah,
thank you very much. But, so, you know, we determined our price last year. So we've had this price in mind for a while. There was a lot of work that went into it. I didn't price Repatha, so I'm not going to speak to the work that went into that.
Right.
Repatha also did not lead in pricing, where this was a little different story. So Amgen, Novartis had the benefit of being the two manufacturers that got to price the product. There were three things that went into the price of our product. We've been very transparent about this along the way with, and we had to determine it early so that in these early conversations, when we were sharing clinical data with the payers, we were able to help them kind of understand where we were going without sharing the price. We did share it before launch, but not that soon before. So the three things that went into it is, one is that we felt that we wanted to ensure that treatment experienced patients that might be able to benefit have access to it. I mean, that is absolutely at the top of the list as far as our goals, that we're not sitting here kind of, payers aren't picking and choosing who's the lucky patient that may be able to see benefit. So that was a huge driver. Second one you hit on, affordability. Now, affordability is such a complex, loaded word. There's affordability for payers, there's affordability for the health system, and there's affordability for patients. And there's no magic number. Medicare, it's $670 a month. It translates to about $8,000. But we know commercial payers, you know, they might go some little under that,
Right.
but they go sort of in that neighborhood. We do not want to be in the specialty tier. We don't think it needs to be, especially given the safety profile and the fact that any retail pharmacy could handle a cold chain storage product. So we wanted to make sure that these patients had co-payment, not co-insurance. And then the last one is we wanted to drive fast access. So, you know, the 21st CARE Act allows manufacturers to now go out and share their clinical data set in advance of launch. It allows us to share price. It allows us to give payers all the information they need to have their P&Ts make their decisions, you know, just pending, you know, final approval
Yeah.
from the FDA.
Yeah.
So we did that for speed of access. So those were the three drivers as far as the price point we chose.
Good. And I know, obviously, the discussion with the PBMs to link better access, more streamlined prior auth with the price is part of what we're seeing that Express Scripts has talked about before with some of its other deals. And this one. And the other thing that feels good is that, you know, we often hear that pharmaceutical industry needs a price or its profits in order to drive future innovation, and it's very hard to innovate in common conditions where the current treatments are cheap generics, you know, that et cetera, et cetera. And yet the price here aligned with the benefit to patients. It seems like it's starting a process that is headed in the right direction. So I assume that means that this price does allow you to innovate in the future. This allows you to capture the return that you need on the investment in the scientific development on this drug. It's a win-win. Is that fair?
It is fair, but you can't charge it. It's not exactly accurate. So it's fair but not accurate. So there's a lot of things that go into price. And, you know, manufacturers have historically been criticized that we just figure out what the most we can charge and then we charge that, right? So I think that paradigm is changing, and I think we've seen it with recent launches, and I hope we'll all agree that we've seen this here as well. So it's complex. So we looked at a value-based price range. So we looked at the value, you know, published in March by Lipton et al. And then we took and we factored in, how are the payers going to respond? How is the healthcare community going to respond? How's the media going to respond? And this isn't, you know, this is not an orphaned disease area. This is not a small niched population. We don't want to be relegated to chronic migraine. You know, it benefits more patients than that. And so when you combine all of those, you end up at a price point. So it's not to say the next therapy that comes along should also be priced below $10,000. I can't speak to that. A complex set of analyses has to be done to be able to evaluate that. I know that we considered multiple stakeholders, patients at the forefront, and also, you know, some very complex modeling done by our own health economists. So, in which you know many of them. So.
We do.
Yeah.
Everett, anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, a big factor, and because we have these conversations with manufacturers, and we had the product that came out about 6 months ago for atopic dermatitis at $30,000 a year, and we thought that actually was probably responsibly priced as well. But you have to look at the number of patients. And what we wanted to avoid here is what actually has happened in the PCSK9s. PCSK9 products were priced like an orphan drug therapy, so the payer market made it an orphan drug therapy. They limited access to only those patients for whom you could justify that price. The lower the price, the more it makes sense.
Right.
Because only in healthcare do we reserve, and there's some good clinical reasons, but only in healthcare, right, do we tell patients that you have to use the old therapy. So when iPhone X came out, they didn't say you can only use it if you make a lot of phone calls and download a lot of data. Otherwise, you got to keep that iPhone 4 that you still
Actually, my company did, but that's all right.
And we do that in healthcare because it's the way we control costs. So ideally, if you can get the cost low enough,
Right.
then you can allow the iPhone 4s to switch out, right? And you know, there's some clinical reasons why you'd want to wait a year or two. But it largely is driven by cost. And, you know, it's a chicken and an egg. If the manufacturer starts out at a low cost, they still may be pigeonholed initially because of clinical reasons and need, and then they won't pay for the research. If they start out too high, they may be self-fulfilling the fact that there's a limit. So
it does feel like
all the companies wanted to try. We didn't want a 15 days or more indication, and that's what would have happened if this had been priced at 2 or 3 times the price.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. You know, let me jump back because it's going to be integral to our final report. I forgot 2 quick things about the prior auth and the coverage rules. Do you think there are going to be, maybe you already know, stopping rules or, because a lot of clinicians may try this, and if the patient's doing very well, and as I think you said, at your month 6 or something, you may say, well, let's take a vacation and see if it gets worse or whether you can go without it. Are you going to have any rules for how long they can take it?
I don't believe you'll see a requirement that it stops.
Yeah.
I think that's really a clinical issue. Unless data comes out that says a significant portion of patients should stop this, it's really hard for a payer. Remember, payers aren't making medical decisions.
Absolutely.
They're just deciding, should they be paying for this?
Right.
It's hard for a payer to say, you're on a drug, you're migraine-free, let's give it a try. What could happen, right? And
how about the other way around? How about if it's not better in 3 months?
If it's not working, you could see some requirements that if it's not working, the challenge with that is, or I think the benefit, and I disagree with the earlier conversation, I do believe in real world, if a patient is injecting this and getting no benefit, you may not see it for a while because of placebo effect.
Right.
But at some point, 4 or 5 months into this, they'll say, I can't tell any difference. They still have a cost. They still have to inject, and they're not going to want to take it. Compliance is terrible with drugs that do work. It's not going to be wonderful with a drug that
That's a quote we can take. That one I like. Kevin, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just want to say that there's no data yet to show any point where these medicines should be stopped. And quite, you imagine from the patient perspective, the cruelty of finally finding something after so much struggle that's working for you, being able to potentially return to your life, return to your job, return to your family, and then being told arbitrarily, oh, because it's working for you, we're going to force you off of it. I just really urge caution and just to think about the human cost of a decision like that if anyone decides to pursue it.
We already get enough bad press. I don't need that.
Yeah, I think too with these products, you know, some cases you do see rapid onset. You know, you see some benefit as early as the first week, and I think that's good, and it can also be a negative because if people start to expect that that's how quickly they're going to see it, you know, they may decide after a month, oh, I haven't seen the benefit, or the physician may see that, and they may make it an early determination to discontinue. But I think that it is good that you're going to see much more rapid onset of these products than probably what you do with the current preventive medications. But we still need to think through, and you know, how long does a person need to be on therapy? Because we continued in our own clinical data, have seen patients that don't see a benefit until they get to 6 months of therapy, and they still continue to see some benefit. So, you know, I think that's one of those things that they just have to measure it, and the best person to measure that is the physician and the patient together.
Okay.
So-
One last hypothetical,
So I
just for
want to say,
sake.
for this,
Oh, go ahead.
I don't see this preventative treatment different than the other preventative treatments that I give to a patient. And so, you know, typically, 3 months, we try something. If it doesn't work, we go on to something else. And typically, 9 months, you're doing really well, and then you have that conversation about, do you have to keep on using it? It's certainly for the patients who have the refractory intractable migraine, it's a different story because, when someone for so many years has not had, relief, wanting to go off of medication, that it's a different discussion. But I don't see why I would do anything differently here. Why would I make a patient take something for 6 months to see if it's going to work, right? Because there are other, we've been using medicines without evidence for migraine for decades. But so, that's our recommendations are give it 3 months.
Okay.
And then, if it's working at 9 months, that's when you consider going off. My suspicion, based on, not with the patients who've tried many, many things, but as you go to the experienced but sort of less intractable migraine, is the patients will do what they do now. They will self-taper. They will, they will at some point, they'll use it, they'll feel good, and then they're going to try on their own. This is what patients do.
Yeah, a little
They'll
bit
try on their own, say,
trial.
okay, can I go off with it? And they'll come back to you and say, I missed it for a month and my headache got worse, or I haven't taken it for 3 months, I'm still doing great.
Or maybe
So they-
Kaiser should make a whole bunch of saline injectables and let them do an N-of-1 trial. Maybe not.
And so-
Maybe not. Let me keep going. I need to be my own best time master here. I'm going to lead you through a couple real quick other additional questions, and then I want to let you guys make some summary comments. I can't get away, though, even though we've kind of rained confetti down to a certain extent on the pricing process, the outcomes preliminarily for patients. If the price had been even lower, had been $2,000 a year or $3,000, would it have been even better for patients in terms of access? Would it have made any substantive difference?
Honestly,
Generically, just kind of conceptually, are we still in this kind of...
It would be better for the country if it was lower, and it would be better for patient out-of-pockets. It would not have made a difference in our coverage. We were able to negotiate to a point, and the list price is not the point. I believe this price will come down. In fact, I know it will. Aaron's job is to drive the price down by bringing out the second product. And so we have hopes of a $2,000 a year therapy.
All right,
So can
we'll
I
come
just
back.
make one comment on that? Because I think this is something that's, pricing
Did you
is-
want to agree?
Anyway, well, shoot.
But I think something that gets kind of lost is, there's a WAC price, and yes, Everett's already made mention of it. Obviously, we live in an ecosystem where discounts are absolutely required. There's
Right.
that. There 40% of the commercial population's on high deductible plans. You're paying down copays that sometimes are the entire cost of the drug. You're paying the wholesaler. You're paying for distribution potentially additionally. So I just don't want that to get lost in the conversation, that it's not that manufacturers wouldn't love, but we literally are giving a little bit to a lot of different intermediaries. And until the ecosystem changes, until that evolves, it's really challenging for a manufacturer to launch a biologic, a monoclonal antibody that's been in development for 10 years for $2,000. I mean, it literally, because of how many people have to be paid. So I just don't want that to get lost in all these pricing discussions. And
Understood.
so I'm off my soapbox. So
I understood.
hand it
All
back
right.
over.
So now I'm going to do what we need to do to talk about potential budget impact, because we've kind of skirted that, touched on it at several points. But I like to start with the clinical experts. What % of patients with chronic and episodic migraine do we think should be given a trial of CGRPs, should be brought in and given a trial, assuming that they have tried other preventive therapy? I mean, is the real goal here to get them all? I mean, is there a view that that's what we should be doing? Because if we're going to think about potential budget impact, we kind of have to have a thought, not just of what's feasible, but what's kind of ideal from the clinical perspective. Would you think that, well, what % of kind of the eligible patients do you think we really should reach out to and see if we can get them on a CGRP?
I've struggled with this question from many different angles. It is so hard to answer because, I see all the difficult headache patients for Southern California. And so my perspective is very skewed. So I have a whole group of, patients, sort of a list of people who want to try it once the contracting is finished and it's available. But what my experience is does not reflect that population. So it's really hard. It's really hard to say.
I assume, Yvette, do you have anything different?
Yeah, so I am considered community neurologist. I see the general type, complex migraines and chronic migraines. I would say that the folks I see right now are pretty decently controlled. So I would be a minority of my patients who are at the point where,
Mine are your patients, but of those that we know already, I mean, I'm getting a sense that this is a drug because of the safety profile, at least as we know now. I mean, there's going to be some caution given the harms, the early data, but is this going to be one where if you have a patient who has tried and failed 2 or 3 other treatments, is there any reason that you wouldn't feel that they should be given a trial of a CGRP?
It would be because it is FDA approved and because we have so few FDA approved or even evidence-based by the American Academy of Neurology or Canadian guidelines, it comes into the discussion. So it is something that is offered when we talk with patients. We give them, this is the variety of what we have. We have with evidence, we have without evidence. We have FDA approved, we have non-FDA approved. And it comes into that discussion. I agree, with Yvette, most of my patients I see are controlled. But it really ends up being, and we try to figure this out for ourselves. How many patients do we think we're going to have? So we can tell pharmacy. We have no idea.
Everett, you must have done the math. You must have some idea of how many patients we're talking about within your population.
We have, and we've looked at the math, and I actually think that you were right, or your group was right when they said the number of patients that are potential candidates for this, but we think it'll be a fraction of that uses this, certainly within the first couple of years. There's a hesitancy among physicians to use new drugs. A lot of migraine sufferers, even ones that exceed the 4 a month, don't come in, so they're not really seeking help. They're self-medicating. We expect it'll be on the low end of your numbers, maybe even under your numbers early on. I think the real question is, what do we see 3, 4, 5 years from now?
Right.
But adoption is typically slow in most of these products.
And I have a funny feeling we'll be back around some virtual or real table when there's an oral form of CGRPs, because that may, again, kickstart the question around appropriate access, around who gets to prescribe all these things that we've been talking about. There are a lot of other things we could focus on right now, but we've hit the high points. We haven't talked about future research. I'll just note that. We have some thoughts ourselves. Every time we look at a body of evidence, we come away thinking, boy, we could have done this better. We know that if they'd used this outcome measure instead of that one and had the patient eligibility lined up, we could have done a much better indirect comparison. But what I want to do now, because our last phase here in the last 23 minutes, I'd like to give each of our Policy Roundtable members a chance to have a 1-sentence closing statement. This would allow you to name the one thing that you think is the most important theme or message that you want the final report to reflect. I often encourage people to think of the one request that you would make of any other stakeholder that could make the world a better place, could improve patient outcomes, could help us control costs, whatever it might look like from your perspective. What's the one thing you would ask somebody else to do? It can even be something you'd ask your own groups to do. But feel free to make a request like that or just to hit something you've already hit with another swing of the hammer. So why don't I start down with our patient folks and we'll come this way.
I was praying you would
So
start.
one sentence, I usually say, this is an old standard, 1 semicolon within this sentence, all right? So for those of you who still use semicolons, my kids don't even know what that is, but anyway, so go with 1 sentence.
Punctuation is really so important, isn't it?
So please, Jill.
I would like to leave this message with the panel, and that is that migraine is a very disabling disease, and people are affected whether or not they have chronic or episodic, and not only are they affected, their families, their employers, their schools, every aspect of their life is negatively impacted. I'd like to see that the episodic patients be given as much credit for their disease process as the people who have chronic migraine.
Thank you very much. Kevin?
I will commend Express Scripts for having a reasonable and responsible access policy, and I would call on all other healthcare stakeholders who are in a position, the insurers and the PBMs, to follow that model that I think is appropriate and will enable treatment of this disease in a way that is to the appropriate benefit of patients. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Sonia?
So I have to say that I found just participating as an expert reviewer from the beginning to be very, very helpful. I think that the information that's gained for everybody involved is incredibly important, because what we are lacking in the treatment of migraine is comparative efficacy. I wish those trials would be done, and this is a real, it's the best surrogate that we have. I also commend the patient involvement and being able to really look at the comments that were given by patients and incorporated into the report that I think I haven't seen often or before, that understanding of what the lived experience with migraine may be.
Thank you very much.
So I echo Kevin's sentiments. I'm really happy that there's a new medication out for this, and my biggest ask before this meeting was that the medication would be made provided in a way that patients would have good access in terms of policy and cost for the payers, the patients, and everybody involved. So I'm really actually happy that we're all here.
Good, thank you. Everett.
I want to, again, thank Amgen for bringing the product out at a responsible price. And I think it's incumbent on the payers, which I represent on behalf of companies such as CalPERS and many other employers, and manufacturers to get the price and the access correct so that we can then be out of the way and let the physicians manage the patients, which I think is ultimately the goal of everybody in the room. We just don't get there very often.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
Aaron,
I'll probably echo what was already said, and that's ensuring the patients have access to these medications. I think it's critically important, and they've demonstrated benefit and clinically meaningful benefit, and we need to make sure that the patients have the access, and that patients and physicians have a choice. Once the access is there, that they have a choice between the different anti-CGRPs. So my last commercial is that the fremanezumab is not a product that has been approved yet. We do expect some sort of action by the FDA in September. At that time, again, we hope that we can help all the patients and folks like Katie that have so desperately wanted these new additional medications.
All right, thank you. Amy.
It's just as hard being at the end of the table as it is being at the beginning, because so many great things have been said. But really, I mean, patients have waited too long for innovation that was specifically designed for migraine. And so, semicolon. And so, semicolon, they and the physicians, nurse practitioners, and health community that treats them does deserve fair and timely access, so that manufacturers and payers, we can all get out of the way and, let these patients be helped.
Thank you. Richard?
Thanks, Oprah. Before my semicolon, I'm going to read to you some lyrics from the song Seasons of Love, which you might have heard at the Tony Awards this past weekend. 525,600 minutes. How do you measure the life of a woman or a man? And after my semicolon, I want to thank ICER for pulling together all this information and for pulling together many different perspectives on the problem. We grapple with these issues every day at CalPERS, and I'm sure other purchasers do, balancing access and cost and effectiveness, et cetera. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right. Actually, I'm going to do a shameless search for a plug from Everett, and maybe from Richard too. I'm just kind of curious, because I should have asked this earlier. Amgen had done its modeling and had other ways to think about its pricing. Does having this kind of public meeting, having an independent report, does it support kind of your thinking in some way that wouldn't be the same as if you just had the material from...
The toughest thing in medicine today, the reality is the price of drugs is usually a negotiation between manufacturers and the payers. But the hardest part of figuring out what a drug should cost, what that value is, what that fair price is something that ICER has stepped forward and is doing, and it's very valuable for us. We try to get it as low as we can, and manufacturers try to get it to a point where they're making a profit they believe makes sense. But ultimately, there is a right price for these products, and it is very helpful. And we do use your number in a lot of disease states as something. Sometimes we pay more, and sometimes we pay less, but it does give us, if you will, a blue book value of what that should cost.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it. All right, we're going to go around the CTAF panel, ending with the chair. We've got 15 minutes left for 13 of you. So there's your semicolon and your charge. We'll start with Dr. Klingman.
You really want to start with me?
Yes, I do.
All right.
Pressure's on.
I have a few observations. First off, for those that don't know about safety, most of the docs here have been through several drugs that came out and looked perfectly safe and ended up killing people. So this notion about it's perfectly safe because it's been studied, yeah, maybe, but we'll see. I mean, I just seen it happen before. So when your doctor is worried about safety, he's not trying to withhold it. He's been there. You haven't seen it, but we've seen it. We've seen them pulled off the market. It's a real thing. So that anxiety is not trying to withhold thing. It's just the fact that we've been there before, and that's why you don't want to be the first doctor on the block to use the drug. A few other things, and this is actually, I'm going to give some advice to our patient advocates. Migraines are in fact awful. Migraines are in fact expensive, and we're really, really looking forward, those of us that do this for a living, to being able to offer these drugs as many people as are appropriate. But I have to say that blind advocacy for unrestricted access for all patients at any price is really doing patients a disservice. I'm not criticizing, but CTAF is looking at value is absolutely in patients' interest. And so this process of looking at value and trying to set value, really valuable, because advocating for lower prices is really helpful. Pricing is a choice that manufacturers make. It's often not based on cost of production. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't. And so being able to have a conversation about what's an appropriate price is hugely valuable in this world where prices are go up, because lower price equals more access, as was mentioned. If this drug was a lot less expensive, we wouldn't be having as much anxiety. And I'm not saying it was priced poorly. I just want, in general, people to think about the fact that price also is a factor in patient access. And you guys have a lot of power in, in your advocacy role. And so I would just argue, and just that the idea about advocacy for access also might be something around advocacy for price points. Because I'll tell you, people will find ways to make drugs less available due to cost. There's going to be something. It's going to be guidelines, or we're going to do step therapy or put in pre-authorization. And coming down at a lower price, you see all the things that happen less. I hope it goes down to $2,000. I live in the world of MS drugs where they go up at 15% per year regardless, so I hope that's true. And then a recommendation for the manufacturers. Manufacturers should be advocating for appropriate evidence-based use in marketing. So kudos to say, we're not saying that this is for everybody, because if you are advocating for appropriate use, then that price that may be somewhat higher is going to scare people less, and they're not going to put as many restrictions in. So again, I think that my recommendation is for advocacy should be both for access, but also for discussion around rational pricing.
All right, thank you. Felicia?
I guess maybe I'm not as anxious about high prices, not because I'm particularly concerned about making sure all the people who do this work get paid, because that's not my job. I like that it makes us think that when a drug is priced high, we have to really think about when, how, and if to use it. And I think that's incredibly important, and something I think as a society, as a culture, we don't spend enough time on. And with the marketing campaigns now, ask your doctor if this drug is right for you, when the reality is your doctor probably really has no idea. With the exception of maybe doctors like Sonia, and you make me glad that I'm a Kaiser member, I'm hoping I never need your services, but if I do, I'm going to come find you, who are so thoughtful about the mechanisms and what you've been through and the pricing. I don't think most doctors are that thoughtful about it. You come to me, and I'm your doctor, and you have a migraine, and there are medications, and we're going to try something. I guess what I really want to see is the way we spend that money digging for more. You know, we've heard the testimony from all these patients who have tried different things and they don't work, and we have these steps that people have to go through when they don't work, and they are hoping that the next step will. And I can't help but think that if we spent more time figuring out why some things work for some people, we could come up with the mechanisms so that we could better match the drugs to the people. And then we wouldn't have to worry as much about pricing, because if you find something that truly works, it really is priceless.
Well, maybe not priceless, but. All right, I'm now going to slightly scold our first two CTAF members because you've absorbed a little bit more of the semicolon space. So again, encouraging you all to try to be brief. You can be very powerful, but try to be brief. Say?
I mean, I think I don't want to take away from the kind of the prolonged kumbaya moment of where I feel like the pricing and the access, and this clearly is an advance, and all of that is good. But I want to call out kind of two situations where I feel like the profit motive and incentive has led to a paucity of evidence and data that would be most helpful. What people have already talked about. Why are there no head-to-head trials? Well, because it's not in the manufacturer's interest to provide us that data, and they're the deepest pockets to be able to do that. Why don't we have a drug to figure out, even before we try a drug, whether it's going to be helpful? Because there's no research, because from the manufacturer's perspective, it is actually best if everybody has to try it to see if it's going to work. And so overall, I feel like this leads us to an imperfect world where we are right now, where we have to rely on things like network meta-analyses, which requires substantial assumptions about how the placebo groups are similar across trials. And so we are working with very imperfect data. And so I guess what I would like to see is additional incentives so that there are additional incentives so that the evidence that would be most clinically useful, so that we know what is more effective, A versus B, so that we have tests, so that we don't actually have to try something to know if this is going to work. That is the sort of evidence that we need.
Thank you, Alex.
I want to thank the patients for coming and speaking today, and also note that most, maybe all of them would have been excluded from the clinical trials for these new medications, and that we need some mechanism to incentivize not just comparative effectiveness trials, but trials in real-world patients who have tried and multiple medications, are probably on something now, and we should be comparing against what they're on.
Thank you. For brevity, a gold medal. Thank you. Bill.
Well, my four previous panel members have pretty much wrapped up what I was going to say. But just that I'd like to see that there is more research, there is more actual evidence for us to work with. We're trying to make a decision with very, very limited information. And in that situation, you kind of have to put the patient first. And I hope we've done that today.
Great, thank you. Bob?
I'm very happy to see a new drug with a novel mechanism of action for this common debilitating disease. Another arrow in the therapeutic quiver is a very good thing. I remain concerned about two things. Number one, the clinical safety with long-term use for chronic disease. And number two, the cost-benefit ratio and the long-term safety for episodic disease.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Just two quick observations. One is what I call I'll use a big word, the epistemology of medical evidence. What can you know and when do you actually know it? And this particular presentation and consideration was particularly frustrating in that way, not exactly answering the questions we wanted, looking for better design of trials that bring these drugs to market. The second is we did migraines 5+ years ago, and I'm struck by the same thing now as I was then. This is not one disease, it's a number of diseases. And it behooves researchers and drug companies, et cetera, to figure out a way to give this to the 1 in 5 patients, not all 5 patients, that may need the drug.
Yeah, thank you. Jeffrey.
I'm grateful that there are new products and I appreciate how the cost effectiveness modeling helps us consider the proposition of value.
Thanks very much. Pat.
I think we landed in the right place today. It was a lot of balancing and juggling of considerations. My comment to the manufacturers echoes what everybody else has said about the curation of studies and the long-term or short-term nature of them. And I would like to see studies that explore why most people that have migraines are women and that those taper off post-menopause.
Thank you very much. Joy.
So this was a really interesting meeting, and I appreciate the contributions of all the people on the policy roundtable, but I'm struck that there's sort of this sense of, well, we're done with this one kind of a thing. We've got the FDA approval, we've got the price set, we've got some guidelines for how we're going to go forward with using it, and I would really emphasize that your work, the advocates, the manufacturers, the pharmacy benefit managers, is not done at all. That we really, to understand what's going on here, need more data about harms and long-term use. We need comparative trials to understand what works for whom when. And I'm going to hazard the prediction that in 5 more years, we'll have another meeting about migraines because there will still be a substantial group of people who can't get control even with this new exciting medication. And we really need to understand that severe chronic pain syndrome that includes migraine headaches.
Thank you. Kim.
Well, I think Pat and Joy set me up perfectly for making the comment that I think that the price was set so that it's almost comparable for what's going on now for people who have chronic pain and previously treated migraines. So I think we're going to see widespread use because of patient choice. And so I'd just like to make the plea that given that this is frequent in reproductive age women, that we're very aware of what the pregnancy-related risks are and family planning and contraception counseling, and that the registry for that and, the doctors who are not only prescribing, but those of us who will subsequently be treating, get the data on how to advise these women.
Thank you. Bob?
Okay. I don't know how many semicolons I get, so I'll try and string it together anyway. The voting question 7, I might as well start out with that's the first note that I made here. For what it's worth, I voted right, quote unquote. Kevin, I'm not going to pick on you personally, but I am going to actually name you because you used the word paternalistic. That's a 27-year-old word that we started using in breast cancer a long damn time ago, and it actually doesn't fit very well in this venue anymore. Just a little heads up on the thing. The term nowadays that really pisses me off every time I hear it is patient-centric. The only person in the world that ever really applies to is an individual patient, and anybody in the system using it, frankly, deserves a punch in the nose. And I don't mean that personally to you, Amy, either. I really don't. It's getting carried away. I'm tired of this, too. 4 years ago is when the meeting was, not 5. I looked it up. I'm on the migraine merry-go-round with all the rest of you here. I know that every single patient has to want to get off that damn merry-go-round. I want to get off of it right here. It's not about access. It's not about choice. It's about clarity. And nobody has clarity on this thing yet. And not to pick on Kevin in particular again, but just because you're the guy here that's the target of this, I read through these are the public comments. The ICER response version of them. I read through all 500 pages of these damn things. It's what I do when I do this. A little personal commitment. It's aggravating as all hell every single damn time on all scores. The thing that has to change here to get us off the migraine merry-go-round, is patients need to get involved. Advocacy groups need to get off the paternalistic tilt of their own. Get involved at the conceptual stage of trial design with the manufacturers that are on everybody's conflict of interest now. There has to be pushback that there hasn't been before into the system in a deep, inculcated way so that we actually have the data that we need in the FDA approval trials where nobody thinks it belongs right now except all of us when we get to this particular point. That is the only way the patients are going to have clarity of choice. That's what they all want right now. They want to know which damn drug works, which one goes next. Which one after this? Not running around and trying out the next damn thing. Sorry, off soapbox. Good luck.
So I found today's meeting exciting, but it also makes me very anxious. I think it's very exciting because we are in this phase where the path and the time from discovery to drug development is really compressed and accelerated compared to what it was 20 years ago. And so you can go from bench to bedside in terms of actually coming up with a mechanism and having a drug in the market pretty soon. This other part of that, though, is that there's a wealth of data that we used to have about alternate mechanisms, off-target effects, and other organ systems that we simply lack in many drugs that come to market. In particular, in this case, as Jeff was saying before, we have deep experience with many drugs across many different disease areas that have been approved because they seemed like a great idea at the time, and no one had any reason to believe that there was going to be an off-target effect or harm. This is a little bit different in that we actually know that there are potential issues with wound healing, with cardiac, pulmonary, and vascular homeostasis, and we really don't have appropriate data to be able to even project out, and there really doesn't seem to be a plan, a cogent, cohesive plan to capture that data. I think my wish list would have been a much more muscular REMS recommendation from FDA in terms of how we're going to monitor these patients long-term, because the types of effects that we might see are long-term effects, not short-term tolerability, which is different than long-term safety.
All right, thanks. So very briefly, because we're at time, thank you to the CTAF panel for those comments. I need to do a couple of acknowledgments before I have very brief closing remarks. First, I really would like to thank all of you who've come to the meeting, some of you from far away. To sit through a whole day in a room like this is not always easy for multiple reasons, but really appreciated the public comment from the patients and the patient groups, the different perspectives we got from that, from the employer perspective as well. So I just wanted to thank again sincerely those who took the time and effort to contribute, not just today, but through the scoping phase 8 months ago and all the way through. You really helped improve this process. Thank you. I'd also like to really thank our policy roundtable. We work hard to get a great perspective from different people. They come from far away sometimes, and they often get a chance to speak for about 2 or 3 minutes during this entire phase. But again, you can imagine the richness of this kind of conversation if we were having more of these in the public domain as we talk about innovation, as we talk about the future needs. And without our policy roundtable, it would lack a lot of the richness. So thank you to each and every one of you for coming and doing this. Thank you to the ICER staff and to our University of Illinois colleagues. 3 quick things. One is, and this has been touched upon, but the idea that there is a wealth of future research that's needed now. It was needed before. Bob, don't punch me later. It was needed before, but now too. Now we need to know, I talked to a clinical expert who was saying we need to talk more about how it's going to be used kind of layered in with other treatments and how we're going to study that as opposed to the kind of sequential ABC. All kinds of research among the sickest patients. that were excluded from the original trials. Should have been there originally, but let's go out and get it now. So again, patient advocates, we often, I don't know, you probably don't think it's fair, but we say, you guys have all this power. You probably don't feel that way. But raise a ruckus, get better research now, if not, and for the next cycle of new treatments, because we know that there are going to be patients with migraine, again, who are not going to be adequately treated. Two other last quick things. One is, we touched on it briefly, but there are millions of Americans, 20% of women, who have migraine. Many of them are not adequately treated with current medications and all the other things we could do. The potential budget impact here is huge. Even when we get the pricing right for long-term value, we are going to struggle as a health system and as a society to try to pay for all this. If we had a value-based price for a good treatment for Alzheimer's and one for ADHD and everything, we're going to run out of money to pay for good value. And so it's going to mean hard choices about how we continue to think about access, prioritization of treatment. So I commend again the manufacturer and the payers who have started to work about linking good access to a price, weaving in some of the uncertainty as part of that, weaving in the idea that patients should try cheaper medicines and see if they work for them, all of that. Because maybe it's because I am a primary care doctor and I've seen plenty of migraine, but I've also seen lots of low back pain. And it dawns on me that when I hear that 20% of Americans have migraine, and now we're going to be treating it with a $5,000 a year drug for some patients, I think of low back pain patients who end up in the OR. And we have a pretty easy slope towards over-medicalizing things in our society. And I'm not saying that migraine doesn't deserve a lot of medical attention, but I hope the patient groups are also willing to keep a holistic view here, because patients really should, like I tell low back pain patients, do other things too, lifestyle changes, other things. We need to keep a holistic view here because we could rapidly come to a very over-medicalized approach to headache, which I think could really cause some real problems. So that's my slight dark lining to a cloud which is dominated by the brilliant innovation and the science. It's led to new treatments for patients. They're going to be able to get these at a price that aligns with value. That's good news. Thank you for your participation today, and we'll follow up with all of you after the meeting. Thank you.